discussion as well, whether you want to drop something into the chat box or speak to them directly by raising your hand and answering questions as well. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our three inspirational ladies. So if I'm to start with Jane, I'd love to introduce you to the audience and for them to understand how you got into this field of sustainability.
Hi Georgia, thank you, and hi everyone. I'm Jane White. I am the Executive Director of a company called AUD, which is the Association of University Directors of Estates. Essentially, it was set up by universities to help kind of oversee and have that kind of helicopter view of universities from the built environment and estates and facility side of how a university operates. So massively, the day job is all about sustainability, and particularly the road to net zero carbon and how to help universities navigate that path. I was born in Huddersfield, just like to state that. Did all my schooling in Huddersfield, then went to Leicester University, did a degree in geography. Did a master's degree in geographical information systems, which is kind of like the computer programming side of geography, satellites and mapping and things. And then started a PhD at the University of Loughborough on design and civil engineering, but didn't finish it. And my jobs kind of have been really eclectic. So I started off working for a local authority, actually, doing a health and safety and environment role, and got really into the law and understanding regulation and how that impacted on the way that, everything happened, from schools to building houses to absolutely everything. And then moved on to a role at a charity, and I was director of research at a charity, and that was super, super interesting. So we were looking at all sorts of stuff there, commissioning universities to do big pieces of empirical research into tons and tons of topics, but more often than not, backlinked into sustainability and the environment. And that was really good fun. That took me all over the world, which was pretty exciting. And then had a family and decided perhaps it was time to stay a little bit more local. And this particular position came up based at the University of Loughborough, actually. And so I took it and have been working there ever since.
What would you say is your greatest achievement whilst you've been working in this field?
Over the last 2 or 3 years, we've worked collaboratively with a lot of different associations and organisations that have got a real interest and a foot in sustainability. And we created a kind of an online portal, a tool called the Sustainability Leadership Scorecard, which enables all universities and colleges for free of charge to access the portal and essentially map their sustainability journeys really comprehensively. So everything, including what's in the curriculum, down to procurement, down to strategy, maps against all the SDGs, includes all the different ISO standards. So essentially a university can see where they are on their journey and then benchmark where they want to be. So that was a big project, involved some government funding. We work very closely with our partners, the EAUC, and that's gone super well, and it's been very well received.
Brilliant. And what feels most important to you that you're currently working on at the moment? Is there anything that stands out?
Yeah, we're really focused in helping universities achieve their net zero carbon targets, which is actually really tricky and really difficult to do. And we're working very closely with government at the moment and different kind of regulatory authorities. It's quite challenging because sometimes I think we think others hold the answers to some of these problems, and they don't actually. A lot of the work you've got to kind of do yourself, or realise that within the sector there's so much incredible work, research, pilot projects going on that we can actually do a lot to learn from each other.
And could we talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you've come across in getting these ideas forward? You just spoke then about government initiatives and that sort of thing.
Yeah, there's always going to be funding will be an issue. So trying to get funding for a lot of these projects is tricky, but where there's a will, there's a way, and we manage. Buy-in is not an issue because this is the issue of our generation, of all time. So right from the VC through to government departments, everybody knows that this is where we are and where we need to go and what we need to be doing. So that particularly isn't an issue. I think making sure that projects have that kind of longevity, that we can see them through, that they are in themselves sustainable and they're meeting the needs and they have that flexibility to evolve as different things evolve. One of the bigger challenges I think we've got is around data. There's not often the right kind of data collected to be able to support some of the initiatives we're doing. So that's a particular challenge.
That's great, thank you so much. I'd love to introduce our next panelist that we'll be speaking to today. And we've got Julia with us as well.
Hello.
Hi, Julia.
Hi, thanks for having me.
No problem at all. If you'd like to introduce yourself to the audience and just talk a little bit about how you got to where you are now and some of the things that inspired you along the way, it'd be brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, my name is Julia Roebuck. I grew up in Huddersfield, so went to high school and college in Huddersfield, and I have always made clothes. So I run a circular clothing practice called Upcycle Fashion. I work freelance and on a self-employed basis. So I pitch for freelance contracts, get funding, collaborate with other people. It's a very varied role that is predominantly underpinned by exploring textiles within a circular economy framework, which essentially means I don't like throwing textiles away. And I guess there's a lot of things I talk about in my work is that actually there's no such thing as away. Our stuff always ends up somewhere. You know, we've only got one planet. So my work is about encouraging working with lots of different people to bring together fashion and textiles, education and sustainability. So these are kind of my three core pillars of what I do, and the projects that I go for kind of marry up in various ways and ratios those kind of three approaches. So Upcycle Fashion has been going for about 11 years, and I've always run it freelance alongside other bits of paid employment. So it's never been my full-time role, although I'm gearing up towards that now, which is nice. But it's just fit in really well amongst other work that I've done within the sustainability sector, such as environmental education, and the travel that I've been able to go on as well. So yeah, so Upcycle Fashion is what I do and who I am. And it's very collaborative and sometimes quite stressful, which is running, you know, which any job is, but freelance does bring with it certain other challenges. So.
Despite these challenges, what would you say is your greatest achievement?
Well, my greatest achievement is, I think it's still being here. I think kind of battling everything to kind of have been able to be involved with some really amazing projects. So I can give you a bit of background actually, because I don't think I've fully explained how I got here. But I grew up in Huddersfield. I went to study a foundation course in art and design. I went to study textile design at Chelsea College of Art and Design and stayed within University of the Arts London to also do my MA, which was in fashion and the environment, which was the first sustainable fashion masters of its time back in the day. So that was 2009. Through that MA, I became really aware of the rise of fast fashion. You know, that it really had kind of embedded itself, particularly within youth culture throughout the mid 2000s. We didn't really have any way in which, on a mass scale, all these garments were being dealt with at the end of life. So whilst I was at university, I was really lucky because we had amazing international visiting professors and speakers and researchers, and that was really the time that I had all of the things that I'd done as a kid and make clothes and do charity shop, you know, hauls, and it was that all kind of came to the fore as actually this is called upcycling and loads of other people do it as well. And when I was at university and mid-2000s, there was Aesthetica launched at London Fashion Week. There was loads of independents popping up all over the place, and there was a real movement, like eco-fashion kind of burst out onto the scene. So I really felt like I was lucky to be in the right place at the right time. And that idea of creativity, of collaboration, of really rethinking the industry is something that I still do today, you know, all this time later. So I feel like my achievements are really based on the successes that I've had with those collaborative projects. It's been amazing to work with Woven in Kirklees, which is a big textiles festival we've got here. So I'm on the careers side of that. I've been able to set up a social enterprise with 3 other women working in textiles in Kirklees, to be an affiliate with Mend Assembly, which are based down in Devon. So we've just set up as Thread Republic. So I'm going to give them a shout out for here. And it's really about building the platforms and building the stages for other freelancers to stand on who are really driven by sustainability and community, because I think that actually citizens have a massive role to play. So my achievements are really around those opportunities that we can get to amplify the voices of other people and create change and demonstrate the change that's needed at a really grassroots level. When I reference that career path, I do also have to acknowledge the privilege that I have had as a white, able-bodied, you know, kind of cisgender woman. I've been able to do work experience, like unpaid work experience in London, which is a privilege. I've been able to travel and live and work in London, you know, whilst studying. So I feel like that's something that I'd be interested to explore as well as we move through this, is that there's lots of kind of that intersectionality and recognizing those journeys and supporting others to reach their potential who don't come and you know have that privilege to give them that step up. We need to kind of massively level out the playing field.
Absolutely. Can we talk a little bit about some of your creative projects that you've got going on at the moment?
Yes, so so the main one is Thread Republic. So that's a big exciting opportunity to really make a difference here in Kirklees. So we're focused on enabling and inspiring, encouraging people to come together to rethink how we own clothing. So that's about taking on mending, whether that's ourselves, as you know, kind of using some basic sewing skills and getting back to grips with some of those skills that haven't quite cut through in our formal education, but are actually a fundamental life skill and a really important aspect of clothing ownership, whether we do that ourselves or whether instead of going back to the high street or to the out-of-town shopping centre to buy from a national chain, maybe we look a bit more local for either independent designer makers or independent seamstresses and clothing repair services. So thinking about the money that you've got, how you can best spend that to support your local economy and develop a repair economy that is so essential to the future of improving the opportunities for our clothing industry to stay within those like environmental planetary boundaries.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. So I just want to move on to our final panelist that we have with us today. So we've got Katie as well.
Hello.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. So we've got Katie here who's going to talk a little bit about how she got into the field of sustainability too.
Yeah, thank you, Georgia. So I'm Katie Thomas, and I'm the Senior Strategy Manager for Low Carbon Environment at the York and North Yorkshire Local Enterprise Partnership. So I'll just start there with what the LEP is, and then I'll do a bit of a potted history, how I got into that role. So some of you might have heard of Local Enterprise Partnerships, but a lot of people haven't, and they were set up by government. There's 38 of them across England, and they're designed to really support economic development and growth at a local, more of a sub-regional level. And my role within that organisation is to lead our low carbon and environment team. So there is often a lot of tensions with the overall remit of the organisation being for economic growth. And we want to try and ensure that's good growth and growth that doesn't harm the planet and it's actually good for it. I got into the role mainly, I think, through my previous experience down in Peterborough on the circular economy. And just going back to my university experience, I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Nottingham in geography with business, which I think is where I really got interested in sustainability, because there's such, I think, an overlap there between kind of human geography and society, and then thinking about how we need to become more sustainable. But I think at that point, doing my degree, obviously climate change was a massive issue, but we're only kind of still learning about it. And I think as I was in kind of my late teens, I still thought it was too big a challenge for me to really make a difference on. And then after my degree, I was very much looking for a sustainability role, but I actually found that there wasn't really anything out there at kind of a graduate level, which I think that's changing now, which is brilliant. But I actually I did a year working for my parents in the state agency, which was a very challenging year, working that closely with your family. And then I went on to do a master's at the University of Leeds in sustainability and business. And I really felt like I had to do a master's to kind of get into the world of sustainability. And I did that master's really thinking about working for a business in kind of CSR, corporate social responsibility. But actually through doing the masters, I realised that for a lot of businesses at that time, CSR was a bit of a tick box exercise, and actually businesses would continue kind of making products or delivering services that weren't actually good for people and the planet, but they might just have a few more recycling bins or put in some electric vehicle charging points. But it was doing that master's that I learned about the circular economy, which is something that Julia's obviously just touched upon. And I got really interested in the circular economy as it's a fundamental way to change a business and a business model. So it actually requires businesses redesigning their products so that they completely design out waste. Also, they design their product so that it can be reused, remanufactured, so you're not really losing anything of value. And then I think it was just a bit of a stroke of luck that this job came up in Peterborough to lead their circular city initiative. So that was really, I would say, my first career job. So it's very much being thrown into the deep end. And I just have a memory of my first day in the office where it suddenly hit me that Peterborough had this huge ambition to be the UK's first circular city, but I was actually the only one that was like working full time on it. So I learned a lot through that role about how you actually can enable change and how you can work with lots of different people within your organisation and other organisations to actually inspire them and show that leadership, so that they can actually develop projects and you're essentially not trying to do everything yourself. And then after a couple of years working at Peterborough, I then went on to the job that I'm in now, which has changed a little bit from when I started. I've been here 4 years now. And it started off with very much circular economy focused, and it was a completely new agenda for the local enterprise partnership when I started. So it's very much starting from scratch and actually explaining to my colleagues what the circular economy was, and then from that point developing a strategy for York and North Yorkshire about how we can actually move to a more circular economy. And then my role's broadened now to including low carbon energy and more environment, natural capital side. And I think a key learning with sustainability is that you can't be an expert in everything. And I think that's something that I've definitely struggled with. You want to kind of know all the detail and all the technologies about everything, but actually it's impossible. So I think you have to become quite comfortable with not knowing everything.
So when you've been explaining the premise of a circular economy to your colleagues, how would you term that, just so members of our audience, in case they haven't come across that term before? have a grasp of it?
Yeah. So put simply, I think it's about making the most of everything that you have. So at the moment we have what's called a take, make, dispose economy. So we're taking lots of materials from our planet, making some amazing products out of them, but then often those products are used for either a very short amount of time and end up in the bin, or we're just not fully utilising them, like the cars that are parked outside for the majority of the day, or the clothes in our wardrobes that we're not really wearing every week. So the idea of a circular economy is a complete step change where we're essentially having our materials and resources flowing in a circular fashion in the economy. So nothing of value is lost, and we're really fully trying to use everything that we have.
So what would you say is your greatest achievement in your career so far? Would you say it's been working in Peterborough or in the role that you are now?
Yeah, probably the role that I'm in now. When I came to the role, low carbon in whatever strategies or anything like that we did was always kind of number 10. If there was a list of factors, it would always be kind of recognised, but it would be right at the bottom of the list of priorities. And now we're actually moving towards, we've got an ambition to be carbon negative, England's first carbon negative region. And that has been developed in our latest strategies as like our top level priority, the economic USP of the region. So I think getting that carbon negative ambition at the heart of essentially everything we're doing has probably been, I think for me, one of my biggest achievements. And I'm currently working on at the moment essentially a plan to get us there, which is called our route map to carbon negative. So it'll be a co-owned plan that the Local Enterprise Partnership, as well as local authorities and businesses and other organisations, will own and be committed to delivering, which will hopefully achieve our target of being net zero carbon by 2034 and carbon negative by 2040. So that's been a huge piece of work. We actually launched our consultation on it yesterday. So if anybody's living or working in York and North Yorkshire, drop me a line and I can send that to you. But that's it's incredibly ambitious what we're planning to do. It's retrofitting like 70% of our homes, halving private car journeys, doubling the number of trees that we have in our region. So it's very transformational with what we're planning to do. So we haven't got all the solutions to it yet, but it is really exciting.
It sounds it, and the fact that it's going on now, you know, like you submitted this yesterday, it's really brings it to the forefront of our discussion. So is there anything else that you're doing at the moment within either that scheme or other schemes going on that are really important to you?
Yeah, I think the other really big piece of work that I'm very passionate about is a piece of work that we're doing now at the Yorkshire and Humber scale around the circular economy. So York and North Yorkshire launched our circular economy strategy a couple of years ago, and we've now been asked by Yorkshire and Humber local authorities to build on that work and develop a strategy for the wider Yorkshire region. So we've done a number of collaborative workshops to date, and we're just shaping the framework of that strategy at the moment, and that will have a work programme associated with that. So it's just really exciting that we've been able to kind of build on that work at a sub-regional level to a wider regional approach.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. I'd now like to move on to our Q&A session. So this is where we'll be taking questions from you, our audience. So you can either raise your hand and our members will then direct you to then speak to our panel directly, or you can type something into the chat box and we can read it out and get that question over to our panelists. So we're looking at 3 broad discussion areas just to start off with. So just bear in mind if you've got any questions about navigating the workplace, any careers opportunities and employability opportunities, and any future challenges either that you might be facing, either that the panelists that we have today will be facing, or their companies might be going through too. So I'd just like to start with a question for Julia. So I am a young farmer in Herefordshire, So I'm a shepherdess. I'm currently lambing at the moment, so fingers crossed that my ladies outside keep their legs crossed for the next hour. Yeah, but we're dealing in wool, and there's a real issue at the moment in terms of like the financial viability for sheep farmers and other people in working with these textiles and fabrics. In terms of keeping it going, because there's not much sort of incentive really. Like the prices hit rock bottom. What sort of textiles and fabrics are you focusing on using?
So within my work, I use anything that has been discarded, which is everything, because as Katie said, we are living in this linear economy. So any garments that are no longer wanted, that they can be any material. So they can be the most amazing coats that have come out of a house clearance, you know, vintage clothing from the 60s, right down to, you know, a pair of Primark, you know, ballet slippers. You know, it's really the whole spectrum of materials that we talk about within the circular economy, because it's the whole spectrum of materials that are used. Wool is such an issue, Georgia, and I wonder if, you know, if there's anybody who is listening and engaged with this event today who'd like to kind of feed this in. But we in Kirklees here, you know, our textiles heritage is built on wool, and a lot of that still does exist today, but with imported fleece from New Zealand, you know, kind of a more quality fibre. A lot of the issue, the reason why the wool merchants around now wouldn't necessarily use a British breed, they would argue, I think, would be the quality. But there's a lot of work going on into, well, actually, okay, fair enough, it might not be great for these bespoke luxury suit fabrics and worsted woolens, but what else can they be used for? And I'm so passionate about keeping, you know, this is a textile resource that we grow effectively, you know, in the UK, in England, and developing that infrastructure, I think, is vital work to utilise it to its best capacity. And I think it's absolutely bonkers that it's not, you know, worth your time as a shepherdess to even share them. You know, you effectively have to pay people to take it away, right? When I think there's a lot of other opportunities there, not necessarily within clothing, but what about insulation? You know, there's people making, I think there's people making coffins out of it. It can be turned into carpets. You know, there's a insulation, underlay materials. I think there's a whole cross-sector opportunity there for wool that's not being explored.
Absolutely. So what are you looking for in terms of moving forward with new materials and that sort of thing? Are you what are you focusing on in your projects?
Yeah, so I tend, my work really fits in. So within what we call the waste hierarchy, you'll have all kind of heard it or done the song at school about reduce, reuse, recycle, which we need to be, yes, great, we can recycle, and we need urgently to move towards technical and industrial recycling for fabrics, because you can't recycle a jumper in the same way that you recycle a plastic bottle. They are just, it's a different process. We have a lot of issue with blended fibres that can make that technology quite difficult, how you collect it, how you sort it, the infrastructure around a textiles recycling economy. But those developments and that research is happening at the moment, and it will fulfill a need, because ultimately we all know, we've all had garments that, you know, you wear them as much as you can and they get damaged beyond repair, they get stained, they get, you know, destroyed, the fibers just wear down. That is just what happens. So we do need textile recycling to deal with clothing when they really are at end of life. But we've got a whole mass of textiles that are being discarded, and they have years worth of wear and value left in them. And this is where reusing and reducing comes into play. So for me and my work, I'm not necessarily focused on new materials, but I seek to work with what already exists that becomes waste, not because there's anything wrong with it, but just because of our human mindset and our approach to it. You know, waste is a state of mind is one of my quotes that I use quite a lot in my work and my workshops and my guest lectures. It's about us as humans changing the way we view materials to extend longevity, to innovate within ourselves based on skills to extend that longevity of clothing. So anything that's discarded is what I like to work with.
Brilliant. So we've spoken a little bit about barriers between both of our fields, so whether it's like materials and that sort of thing. What other barriers have you come across as a woman in sustainability? And I'd like to ask this to each of our panelists as well. So I'll start with you, Julia.
Yeah, well, funding, I mean, Jane mentioned funding there. As a freelancer, you know, funding is the lifeblood of what I do, and, you know, kind of constantly going out. So funding bids, especially in the creative sector, can be really last minute. They can be really difficult. Grantium, which is the kind of platform and the portal for any Arts Council funding, is just a constant grind for a lot of creatives going for Arts Council funding. So funding is just a constant sort of battle. But also I feel like it's really important, and it would be remiss of me to come to a Women in Sustainability event and not talk about childcare and the lack of affordable childcare, and how that's been a barrier to me as an entrepreneur and as a freelancer. And I know that there's lots of other women who across the UK who have that same issue. So yeah, those two are mine.
Thank you very much. If I could ask the same question as well to Katie.
Hello, hopefully you can see me now. My Teams is being a bit slow this afternoon. Yeah, I think for me, I think particularly with my first role in the circular economy, I think it's probably a combination of gender and also age, in that I was kind of in my early 20s when I went into that role, and I had an agenda which was, well, which still is, just completely different to what we have now. And painting the picture of what a circular economy is can be very abstract, and if you can kind of sound like you're coming across quite naively with this kind of aspirational world that you want. And I think I definitely struggled, I think probably early on in my career, with being taken seriously with that. And I think I learned a lot about how to frame the circular economy to different audiences, and to make sure you're always doing your research to know what that business or organisation, or even individual, if you're speaking to a counsellor, kind of what they're interested in it, and making sure that you're using their language to do that. And I think similarly with the role that I'm in now, particularly in the public sector, it's very male dominated. It is very kind of white, male and stale. When you're thinking about the senior decision makers and you're going to either boardrooms or if it's councillors or directors from local authorities, I'm often probably going in there as one of the only, if not the only, female, and I think that can be quite challenging. So making sure that you develop relationships with people that you know are your key influencers and key decision makers is just so important, so that you've got those kind of friendly, either male or female allies, I think is just so important, and those people that can amplify what you're saying, so that if you are going into those situations where perhaps you are being stereotyped because of your age or because of your gender or anything else, you know that other people in that room can kind of back up what you're saying, to make sure that whatever you're trying to push, or the decision that you want to come out of that meeting really is kind of taken forward.
Brilliant. And when you're going into these meetings and you feel a little bit apprehensive when you see that board of all male faces staring back at you, what do you tell yourself to get you through that and give you a bit of encouragement to be able to speak up?
Yeah, I think I remember the why, really, kind of why I'm in that situation and why I'm passionate about it. And I think making sure that you're always really well prepared for those meetings is so important as well. So yeah, I think just remember kind of why you're in that room, and also that you usually, like, you have something different to bring to the situation. I think particularly earlier on in my career, I'm sometimes nervous about speaking up, so I'm the youngest person in the room and thinking everybody else has so much more experience than me, kind of why is my opinion important. But I think actually everybody has a different perspective, and just remembering that's kind of what you bring to the table, and often it might be challenging how people are currently thinking.
Brilliant. I've just seen as well, just whilst we're chatting, there's a question that's come up just about explaining carbon negative. How would you phrase that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So essentially, net zero kind of at a regional level is where you reduce your emissions as much as possible and then offset whatever kind of the leftover emissions are. So essentially you're having kind of a net impact on the planet in terms of emissions. But carbon negative is essentially going that one step further, so that you're essentially capturing more carbon out of the atmosphere than you're emitting as a region. So for us in North Yorkshire, we have a real opportunity because of our natural landscapes and also with our seas as well, to be able to sequester carbon in our trees, in our peatlands, in our flower meadows, and also in the sea as well. Things like kelp and seagrass can sequester a significant amount of carbon.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I'd also love to bring Jane in as well on the question that we were talking about before, just about barriers for women and how we overcome them as well. Have you come across any, Jane?
Yeah, unfortunately, I really have, which is a big shame. I suppose from my own experience and perspective, I remember in some of my early days when I announced my maternity leave that I was going off, that my current line manager told me that I'd stitched him up good and proper. And I've had some real experiences, unfortunately, like that throughout my career. And I really do echo oh my gosh, the cost of childcare and running a family whilst being driving a career as well, whether male or female. I've had those days where I've arrived at work with my children still in my car and forgot to take them to school. I've also once arrived at work with 2 different shoes on, not least that one was a lace up and one was a zip. So like that real kind of, okay, this is hard work. But I think being a woman on a board has been very interesting for many reasons, good and bad. I was in my earlier days on a board of 26 where there were 3 females, including myself. One of the other females was a mentor to me, but she had commented on the other female, the 3rd female on the board's appearance, saying negative things because she had purple hair, and she'd really let the side down because women on boards needed to look a very certain way and behave in a certain way, and that was a real shock and a shame to me. So we were quarterly board meetings, and I made sure the next time I arrived at the board meeting I had pink hair. And I would just recommend that just unapologetically be yourself, and that's really important, to carve your own path, and not get knocked, even though it can be very hard not to be knocked, and take that support from your peers and from people, and also I find it very interesting that the kind of support groups that help women in career development, sometimes you can find women that are at the top that don't want them, that aren't supportive of them, because they feel that it somehow undermines the path and the journey that they've taken to get to where they are. And I found that super interesting in some of my experiences on boards. But and also the bigger picture of equality, diversity and inclusion is to get some experts in. I wasn't an expert in this, so we've brought people in to help us look more deeply at the huge benefits of having a much more diverse board and the implications that means for all your staffing. So yeah, be yourself.
Brilliant. And around that, I'm also working in quite a male-dominated industry, as are you all as well. And I think sometimes when there's another woman in the workplace with you, where you're in a situation where it's a lot of men, there's sometimes a bit of competition, and sometimes could also feel like a little bit of cattiness, perhaps, just when it's you and one other person just as the only female voices speaking out. So what do you think that female voices bring into companies and bring into workplaces that we need to be promoting more?
Every voice is a different voice and a different opinion, and I think that's really important, that we have a whole range of voices. a female voice. I'm not quite sure how I would define it, what a female voice brings.
Just the value that we will have.
Yeah, a journey, a different perspective, a different outlook. We often look at different personality types. There's quite a famous psychological testing where you can see what different personality types bring, but someone that perhaps is very caring or nurturing, but you also need someone that's very data driven and output finished, and you also need someone that's a mediator, but then you also need someone that's quite direct and pushing. So, you know, that kind of accumulation of different personality types and traits, whatever gender they come from or sit within, is all really added value.
And Jane, just another question as well for you. How much would you say your role has changed in the last few years with the greater focus on sustainability in university management?
Yeah, it has changed, but on reflection, it was always there. We were just talking about it in different ways. We were talking about the state of the estate and the way that we keep it up to a certain standard and grade, but also the infrastructure of energy and where we're buying our energy from, and the renewable and sustainable, and also massively driven by value for money and cost. So it was always there. But I think now we've got this kind of declaration of our net zero carbon targets. We're talking about it in a very specific and driven and different way, which is perfect. It's the way it should be.
Brilliant. And this is a question for everybody. How do you believe that women can be an ally to other women in sustainability and the wider workplace as well, regardless of seniority? And this is for men too.
I think what Jane was saying, you know, kind of being an ally, amplifying those voices. If there's somebody who's had a great idea, reference that idea to that person, you know, hold people's ideas and support people's ideas around the table, and make space if you feel that you are particularly dominant, you know, or dominating a meeting. You know, if there's 6 people in a meeting, or, you know, should all be talking for 10 minutes, you know, be aware of the privilege that you have and the power that you have, and sometimes just stepping back a bit or giving space for others to speak who might need a bit more support and time to bring their ideas forward, I think is a way that can be really important.
Yeah, and I think I'd agree with what Julia and Jane have said. I think how you started this part of the session, Georgia, was saying around how sometimes you can get a bit of cattiness between women, which I have unfortunately experienced myself, but I think it's really important to address that and actually understand why you might have a bit of tension between someone else, and that's the same regardless of gender. But I think the importance of active listening is really important, really trying to get to the bottom of any challenges that you've got. And similarly, I think with trying to build relationships with men, if you think that they're not being an ally, if they're blocking a lot of what you're saying, really getting to the nub of like why that is, because often like it's because you're not seeing something that they are, or vice versa. So I think just the importance of making that time and space to really get to know people is so important.
Brilliant. And Jane, how can we empower women?
I think we need to amplify each other's voices and create the space to do that. There are so many great initiatives out there and so many great groups. Social media, it can be a good and a bad place, but there are a lot of initiatives there that, and actually and some information. We were talking about childcare earlier. There's the Flex Appeal movement that's just incredible, and that's one to have a look at. And through education as well, to continue to educate ourselves. There are a lot of programs out there for leadership and women in leadership roles that are actually fully funded by apprenticeship levies and different mechanisms. So go looking, go hunting, and see what you can do to progress.
And speaking about those sort of schemes, what sort of future career opportunities do you see in the fields that you're working with for people who might want to come in from, say, universities or outside of this, you know, thinking about masters and where we might be going on our journeys next? If I could bring that one back to Katie.
Yeah, I think there's so many sustainability jobs out there now, so many more than when I was looking after my degree, which I think is brilliant. And almost every large company now has at least one person, if not a team, working on sustainability. So I think there are so many opportunities. And I think if you feel like you need that kind of next step after a degree, I think some sort of master in sustainability is really useful to give you that, I think, technical knowledge, but also to give you that, I guess, holistic approach of what sustainability really means. But in saying that, I would also say look for jobs that don't have sustainability or low carbon or net zero in the job title, because it's always going to be the case that, say, somebody in a meeting that doesn't have net zero or low carbon in their job description speaks up on the agenda. That voice is always going to mean more than, say, someone like me with low carbon in my job title, because that's almost what's expected of you. And I think to really mainstream sustainability, every job is going to have to contribute to our net zero and wider sustainability ambitions.
Brilliant. And if I could bring that one to Jane as well.
I really agree. I don't think there's a single job really that won't have an element of sustainability, and particularly if you're leading a company or creating your own company or initiative, you know, in order to be successful, you will have to be getting all this right, or at least making a really good try at it. I think there are going to be a lot of skill shortages. I think particularly technology, innovation, there are a lot of things that have to change in order for us to get to where we need to be. So I think really that kind of STEM engineering area is going to be a very important place.
Can I put the A into STEM, Jane? Can we make that STEAM?
Of course.
Thank you. But yeah, I think within the creative sector, you know, has a massive opportunity within that innovation, that design, and not just designing products, but designing systems and the ways in which we engage and interact with products. Even just textiles is in itself crosses through so many other sectors, whether that's science or engineering. You know, everything has to be from the chemicals that you dye with to the fleece that needs to be in the insulation, you know, in your buildings. And it's it crosses through so many different topics. And as an outcome for textiles as well, looking at the, you know, it's a global supply chain that is facing a lot of issues that are unfortunately underpinned by climate change. And you know, the approach that we've had to not only manufacturing but also end of life is urgent work to kind of come up with solutions for that in the UK.
Brilliant, thank you. So continuing on with these thoughts about careers and employability, I just wanted to start with you first, Jane. What key skills do you think someone would need to enter the profession that you're in? Which skills would they need to develop to progress into a more senior role, like the one that you're in at the moment?
Oh, okay. I don't think there's a set route. For me, there was a previous career with a lot of knowledge about construction and the environment and health, safety and well-being, which kind of nicely butted into the work that I'm doing now. So essentially mapping all the amazing work that goes on in universities in terms of the research and the learning, and then translating that into the built environment side. I think personal attributes are probably the ones I would focus on. So you would kind of being driven, enjoying what you do, and really seeing the outcome. This university is huge. It's a huge sector, and essentially what we're looking to do is create the leaders of the future, or the people of the future, and the jobs of the future, and those with the skills and the life skills and the experiences. And that's an amazing thing to be a part of, no matter where you are in a university, to be able to look at that and the outputs and see all the incredible people working so hard to those common strategies and goals is pretty rewarding.
Brilliant. And what about you, Katie? What key skills do you think that you need to have in your line of work?
Sorry, wouldn't unmute them. I think for me, I think you need a good kind of base level understanding of sustainability and low carbon. But I think similarly to what Jane was saying, I think a lot of it is about, I guess, personal attributes and more those transferable skills. So I think being resilient is really important. And I also think having those leadership and influencing skills as well. And a big part of my role is how we actually work with stakeholders to, I guess, inspire, influence, but also enable them to collaborate. So it's really knowing kind of how you initiate that collaboration, that project development, but then also knowing when to step away from that project and then let groups of organisations work on projects themselves. And I think we've learned a lot about how we set up that structure to be able to step away and enable kind of that I guess that collaboration between organisations which we're essentially kind of no longer part of. And I think it's just really important as well, a bit like what Jane was saying, that you're passionate about it. I think all these sustainability roles are so challenging, and you need that passion and enthusiasm to keep you going and also to engage other people.
How much of this engaging and encouraging other people is part of your role, Julia? Is that a big skill that you need when you're developing projects?
Absolutely, yeah. You know, especially like I said before, going for funding or being freelance, you know, that networking, that passion that you have for change is fundamentally what's driving every project brief you write, every funding bid you go for, every new person you meet that you could collaborate on with a project. Being really open-minded. As a freelancer, whatever sector you're in, you've got to be part accountant, part designer, part marketer, as well as making the time to do the thing that you actually do, whether that's making a product or selling a service. I'm predominantly service-based in my work, so as project management and kind of brand collaboration and consultancy and guest lecturing. I'm selling that service, but every conversation is an opportunity to start a new project, which is really exciting. So I think being open-minded, being aware, I think Katie said that earlier, like you're never going to know everything. You know, the masters that I did 11 years ago, things have changed so much in the sector. So whatever you're studying, just accept that you're going to be having different conversations in 10 years' time, and keep up to date with the research as well. Always be reading, be aware of what's going on. That, you know, this is to change everything. We need everybody, as Greta Thunberg says. So it's about being open to those conversations. You're going to come up against resistance. That's just part of it. But I think there's a real balance to not being so preachy about what you do. You know, we're fundamentally here because we want to create quite epic system change, and bringing people on that journey. People are in denial. People can be scared. People are very fearful. Some people are really skeptical. I think being able to meet people where they're at and engage in conversations where they're at that don't feel defensive or preachy, and giving examples. And the more we show and the more we can, you know, map those changes and inspire, you know, people to see what's going on. You know, if they can't see it, they can't be it. So I think if it's about telling those stories, making those channels for people to bring people on this journey and for them to feel supported, not scared or like it's too big, you know, you've got to create your own future in the way that sits within yourself in the most comfortable way.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. We've had some great comments and questions in the chat as well. So I'm just going to go on to one of those from Patrick. He's asked, how can some of the barriers be broken down that discourage women from entering STEM? I encounter very few women in the construction projects we undertake at the university, aside from architects or designers. So Jane, if I could get your thoughts on that.
It starts really early on in education, I think, and busting stereotypes right through primary education is who are we visually displaying to our children as the people in these roles, and to create support, not barriers. And there are some great initiatives going on, but you're right, there's still a lot more that we need to do to kind of showcase and highlight and celebrate women in these jobs. And we're not there yet. There's a lot of work still to do.
And Katie, what are your thoughts on some of the barriers?
Yeah, I think similarly to what Jane said, I think it's about exciting women at a young age when they're growing up and inspiring them about what's possible and getting people to understand the very different roles that are available. And I think as well, we need to kind of, within this conversation, think about people that identify as non-binary as well. I manage someone in my team that's non-binary, so doesn't identify as male or female. And I think it's important that through these conversations we think about where people are and make sure that I guess how we're communicating with people doesn't make some people feel excluded when we're thinking about bringing more people, more women into STEM.
Brilliant. And have you got any thoughts on this as well, Julia?
Yeah, I think education is so key right from the get-go. I mean, it's with the arts and with creativity, it's very gendered, but in the kind of opposite way within education, and I don't think that does anyone any favors either. So it's just being able to kind of break those boundaries in terms of making those stories visible and just having the career journeys really open. I think that's a job for the industry to do in terms of engaging more with careers and bringing those stories into young people and making those jobs appealing as well. I think, you know, if somebody's not interested in building stuff, again, like there's a lot of early years research into, you know, nature versus nurture, but, you know, yeah, it's about the stories that we tell. We need to tell different stories about these sectors.
Brilliant. Just thinking again about your careers and different opportunities within them, what opportunities are helpful for you all or have been as part of your career journeys besides paid employment? Are there professional bodies and internships and volunteering opportunities that have been useful to you? So if we could start with Julia on this one.
Yeah, I did work experience, like I mentioned before, like I've been in a privileged position to do unpaid work experience, which you know, at university, which I don't think is great. And maybe there's some people on this call who've got stories about, you know, how they feel about doing that unpaid work experience. But I was in a fortunate position to get a lot of experience. I've been in a position to travel and experience the environmental sector. So when I left university, I worked for an organisation called Waste Watch, who are now Keep Britain Tidy, became part of that charity. So environmental education is sort of what I've always done alongside Upcycle Fashion. So working with young people and around the Eco Schools programme to think about their energy audits in school and waste audits and renewable energy. And I was able to do that in Australia. And work with amazing environment parks out there. So I think seeing how other cultures and, you know, different parts of the world are also facing these issues makes it, you know, you talk about this as a global issue. Actually, when you do travel and see other projects that are focused on sustainability in other countries, it makes you feel a lot more connected and that this is a real key driver. So being able to engage with how other cultures are adapting and dealing with these issues, I think has been really fundamental for my journey. And I do volunteering now. I volunteer in a charity shop, which kind of connects me every week to just as a reminder, if I ever needed it, of the sheer volume of textile waste that's being produced, because donating to charity is a brilliant thing to do, but they are sinking under the weight of our textile waste, and we need to address that issue through that system. Donating to charity isn't just a tick box thing. It needs epic change. So yeah, volunteering is really important. Was my message.
Thank you so much. Jane, are there any opportunities that you've come across?
Yeah, I think I was a free school meals kid. You know, we lived in a council estate. I was the first member of our family, an extended family, to go to university. So I've always been a bit of a hunter in terms of information and knowledge and what I can do. And I had to work all the way through university, and was awarded in the halls of residence. So essentially I got my accommodation for free in order to look out for other students and do various bits and bobs. And that actually, even from that point, it was to gain an understanding of the diversity of people and students in a university setting and what their different needs were, from mental health through to all sorts of different things. And then I've always been a little bit like that. So I've always collected people along the way and never really let them go, because there's so much value in other people and their journeys and their knowledge and their backgrounds and the way they approach and tackle problems. That's just been fascinating and super helpful, and have translated that into more formal kind of coaching and mentoring schemes as I've gone through my career, which has been particularly helpful as well. But yeah, keep people close to you, and all your acquaintances, keep their phone numbers and their emails, because you never know when you might need them again.
Brilliant. And what about you, Katie?
Yeah, when I was at the University of Leeds doing my master's, I got involved in the Green Audit Scheme, which supports the different departments at universities to develop their sustainability initiatives. And I think being part of that project was really useful, I think, to gain a bit of a practical understanding of the challenges around sustainability. And then I think with my career, I really tried to seek out opportunities through my role, I guess, to go that step further, and to, I guess, learn about the work of different teams as well. In my current role in the first year, we set up something called the C team, which was designed to try and engage all the different teams in the organisation around the circular economy, and to really enable that collaboration within the organisation. And we tried to make each of the sessions quite fun, usually bringing some cake or something. And I think just developing those opportunities and kind of using your initiative to do that is really important. And yeah, I think with my job at the moment, there's so much to do that I probably wouldn't have time to do any volunteering on the side. So I think if you can be quite clever and just keep finding new opportunities in your own role to develop, that's quite a useful way of doing things.
That's brilliant. And cake always helps. Cake always helps any situation.
Doesn't it?
That's great. So now we're going to look at the future of women's sustainability, and starting by looking at staying positive. So we've had a great question in the chat box from Kirsty, who's asked, how do you stop yourselves getting too depressed at the slow progress of governments to make significant speedy changes to tackle the climate crisis? And I've got experience in this as well within my BBC Young Reporter climbing and looking at COP26 as well. But I'd love to throw this one to you first of all, Jane. I know that we spoke about it a little bit in your introduction, but what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I've had recent experience. I've been really disappointed. We are currently consulting with the Department for Education on their draft sustainability policy for education. And that's primary through to university. And I was really shocked about the content of and how unambitious the strategy is. And we've had a few meetings and kind of tried to articulate this. And come away, and I don't think that strategy is going to change very much at all, really, even from the consultation. So it is frustrating, because we do need some policy changes to be able to do some of the work that needs doing. So I guess instead you become a little bit resolute to it, and you look for another solution. So where else can we go to try and create the change that we need? And this is power in numbers again. This is, getting together as a collective, and we're working with lots of different organisations at the moment to firstly lobby back at government to make these changes, but also to create a plan B. So one of the examples that I would given earlier about data is there's different types of data on carbons and emissions, Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3. And there's very little collected in terms of that, and that will really show us year on year where we're going, how we're doing against some of the objectives we've set ourselves as a nation and as a sector. So we're looking for ways in which we can get that data collected in another way. Ideally, we would like it mandating from government, but if they're not going to, then we'll try and do it on a voluntary basis if we can.
That's great, thank you. I know that from my own experience as just an individual trying to enact change, I really struggled. And so when I produced my climate piece for the Climate Reporter Scheme, I was looking at sewage pollution in my local region. And to get this topic into the mainstream media, I had to go through a corporation, through the BBC, to bring this to light. I just wondered whether you find working for a large organisation helps as you're making a difference, or it hinders you as it can take so long for things to evolve. If I start with Jane and then I bring this to Katie, that'd be great.
It definitely helps. It definitely helps to have a power of numbers and a louder voice. There are so many committees and red tapes and things to go through to get change, but undoubtedly it helps to be a big voice.
And what do you think about this Katie? Do you, and bringing back to that, how do you stay positive in light of these situations? Do you find it difficult when you're trying to make progress too?
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, there's kind of two parts of this question. There's, I guess, the practical side and what you can do, and then also the emotional side of it. But starting with the practical side, I think obviously it is so frustrating how slow government policy is, and even now they've got their net zero strategy, for a number of areas there's not actually the funding to deliver it attached to it, and government obviously have their ambition to be net zero by 2050, and then as a region we've got our target to be net zero by 2034, so it's significantly faster. So we do have a role in influencing central government policy. So in our current plans to get to net zero, within each of the sections we've almost got a list of policy asks to government saying this is kind of where we need policy either coming at a faster rate or something that government aren't currently thinking of doing. So I think that's quite a practical route to deal with it, kind of identifying where there are gaps and actually how can we make that happen, working with partners and develop or starting that conversation with government. But I think the other part of it is the emotional side of it, and I manage a team that are all incredibly passionate like myself about sustainability, and it often feels like a lot of pressure on us. I think particularly working at regional scale, you almost feel like, oh gosh, it's all on my shoulders or all on my team's shoulders to get to net zero and hit these targets. But these are the same people that most of my team suffer from quite severe climate anxiety. So there are a lot of pressures with that, particularly around workload, and I think coming to like the brink of burnout really, with wanting to do as much as possible but with limited resource. So it is incredibly challenging from that perspective. But I think going back to what I've said in response to previous questions, kind of remembering why you're doing it and then looking back and celebrating the progress that you've made, and that it is slow, but we're so much further than we were a few years ago. And something that a former manager once said to me, which I always find really helpful, is thinking about now is the slowest period of change, like it's going to carry on getting faster and faster. And I think coming back to that is really helpful. But if anybody's seen the latest IPCC report that came out yesterday, obviously it's painting a very bleak picture about climate change and that we're already seeing the irreversible impacts from it. But I think anything we can do ourselves and within our organisations to make sure is that collective responsibility on the journey to reduce emissions is so important.
That's brilliant, thank you so much. And it's so important, the idea of recognising climate anxiety. It's so prevalent amongst young people, and I think in one way or another we're all experiencing some kind of apprehension towards the future. So I just wanted to bring Julia in on this subject as well. In terms of fast fashion, how do you stay positive when you're creating your own projects and this sort of thing against such big, global fashion brands?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as Jane and Katie were speaking, then I was thinking that's interesting because the big players in the fast fashion, industry here in the UK are the ones who actively aren't lobbying, who don't want this change. The Environmental Audit Committee submitted the Fixing Fashion report with 18 recommendations, all of which were rejected by government. There's talks about things like an extended producer responsibility scheme, which they have in France and they have in California. There's talks about having a regulator for this sector versus an adjudicator, and how that would even work, and the kind of all of the kind of workings of how that would work, and in the meantime they are marketing more products, they are selling more products, we are discarding more products. So this is quite urgent work that can't really be left to the industry at large to solve. And one of the ways in which I don't get down is because I see grassroots fashion movements making changes everywhere, and people building, if you're in a community, whether that's in a physical space or an online space or within your sector, and there's nowhere for your voice to be heard, build that stage and make your voice heard. There's ways in which we can do this, and I guarantee you that there's somebody who lives near to you that shares the same particular, we're coming at it from clothing and textiles anyway. There's movements. We've got Fashion Revolution movement, definitely check that out. Their campaign is every April on the anniversary of the collapse of the Rana Plaza, which was a big garment factory in Bangladesh. So that's citizens pushing brands to be transparent and wanting brands to be accountable for these products, and saying, if you're not going to tell me, I'm not going to spend my money with you. And again, it comes back to what I was saying at the beginning. We hold so much power. I'm going to use the word consumer in the way that retailers would use it. That power that we hold and that money that we hold, where we choose to spend that money, makes a massive difference, because that is what the brands will listen to, where that money goes. And to do your research as well. I don't think that we can be greenwashed. There's a lot of information, there's podcasts, there's reports that are coming out all the time. It's not difficult at all to find a really reliable source of transparent information, even through Instagram. And holding your brands account, and kind of not being swayed. They can't just say sustainable collection or conscious collection anymore, whilst they're still churning out 90% of their other collections that are not sustainable. People are waking up to it, and the active choices that you make as an individual, banded together, make a huge difference.
So speaking about then the way that fashion brands are using social media and that sort of thing, do you think social media is important for each of you to boost your platform and raise your voice, as well as being a woman and having that chance to speak up? If I could say to Julia, yeah.
Yeah, I am definitely for the creative sector, because it is so visual. So Instagram's a brilliant visual platform, and also the way using these visual platforms forces you to present data to people that's really clear. People aren't going to sit and read a 100-page report, but if you break that down into some key statistics, some key facts, that we can get that information across. I'm not always a fan of, we can kind of lose the nuance in debate if it's just forced into 240 characters. But I think there's a place for strong visuals that tell the story, that present the data in ways that everybody can engage, meet everybody at where they're at with it. I think social media is good for that.
Brilliant. I've got another question that's come through. Do you think that the female voice can help make progress? So there have been some studies that suggest that nations with female leaders are more resilient to crisis. So, for example, the pandemic and climate change. Do we need more female voices here in the UK and globally to help share this higher level change? So if I could start with Jane on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, we do. But we need a lot of different voices, not just female voices, and that's going back to the whole equality, diversity and inclusion agenda again. We are still really, really rubbish at decision makers and the representation of our population and who we are. I think just looking at the student voice in the work that I do with universities, it's so amazing, it's so powerful. And as a group, the students are so well organised and well articulated, and the information they collect and the work they do, and when they join together, the power they have is just incredible, and it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant, and it's so helpful for the work that I do. And yeah, I do think we need more voices.
Brilliant. And if I could give that one to Katie as well.
Yeah, I think one example really springs to mind for me from the pandemic, and that's the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern. I think the leadership that she provided just was so different from a lot of what we saw in Europe, with quickly shutting down the borders and really protecting their population. And I think what was quite instrumental with enabling her to do that is that I think it was the year before, New Zealand changed their model essentially of how they were looking at measuring progress. So it was no longer just kind of GDP as the main goal. They actually put social and environmental factors at the heart of how they're measuring development. So that meant that when they were looking at what to do with COVID, it wasn't just thinking about the impact on their economy, they're actually thinking about the people in their communities as well. So I think that's such an amazing example. And I think what's interesting from that, with the direction of travel from the UK government, some of you might be aware that a few weeks ago that the government published a paper called the Levelling Up White Paper, which is all about how we actually level up the economy and address the long-standing issues with some areas and some parts of society getting more investment than others. And in that paper, it actually starts to set out a similar model to what is in New Zealand, around looking at a six capitals approach, where we're thinking about the capital of people, people's skills, the community, social cohesion, and not just broadly thinking in economic terms. So I very much see that Levelling Up White Paper as the first step for this government thinking differently. And I think that's probably a mixture of male and female leadership that's gone into that. But I think certainly in the public sector, there is so much opportunity for more female leadership in senior positions, I think, to get that balance across.
Sorry, I'm on mute. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on this, Julia, too, especially in terms of like local economies and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think just something that I was thinking about, which ties on nicely, Katie, from what you're saying, just in terms of rethinking what success is. There's a lot of within economics, and we talk about how we measure progress in GDP, but also all the stuff that leaves out, and but that is fundamental to our culture. And it's I think what I've been able to bring into my work is defining my own success. What success is to me. I'm not a person that's massively driven by money. Wouldn't be a freelancer in the creative sector if I was. But it's about what do I want out of my work, and what does a successful career mean to me. And that's the flexibility and being able to work around family and being able to be creative. I feel like throughout recent history, women maybe 10 or 20 years ago in the workplace, especially in the 90s, you'd wear the power suit, you'd go in, you'd pretend that you didn't have children, you'd get a nanny, you wouldn't, you'd be at every meeting. If they said 7 a.m, you'd be there at 7 a.m, even if it meant a world of chaos sorting childcare. No, that that the times are different. We are, you bring your full honest self to work. Don't pretend to be a white man in a suit. Be you, bring you, and set your own agenda for what success means to you. Find yourself in a situation where you don't feel that you're able to meet those ambitions, then you need to change to find your own track, because you work for a long time.
That's brilliant, and that just feeds into a question that we've had from Emily as well, who just asked, what advice would you give to people just starting out in careers, or perhaps what would you tell your younger self? So if we could start with Jane on that one.
I loved what Julia just said there. I wish I would have been my authentic self much earlier on. and stopped trying to please others or conform to what I thought I was supposed to be in the workplace. I would be a little bit more brash and a little bit more unapologetic in a very polite and professional way, of course. But I think I would have stomped a little bit more and made sure I got my own way. And I think it's about collecting as much information as you can. I've always been really interested in a lot of different things and spent a lot of time making sure I research them or look into them or join groups or whatever. But I think that's a really good tip, is just to really absorb as much as you can, and then you can make proper informed decisions about where your next steps are, where your passions are, and where you want your career to go.
Brilliant. Katie, what would you tell your younger self?
Yeah, a lot of what Jane said resonated with me. I think definitely around being brave and bold and speaking up when you've got something to say, and I guess trusting your instincts really, and not worrying too much about making mistakes. I think if you go through the first couple of years of your career and you haven't made a single mistake, you're probably kind of not pushing yourself enough out of your comfort zone. So yeah, don't worry about too much making mistakes. And I'd say I think young people are under a lot of pressure at the moment to find things that they're really passionate about in terms of their career, which is obviously brilliant if you are able to find that. But I know I've got a lot of friends that actually took them a while to find what they're passionate about. So I guess don't worry if your first job isn't perfect. I think that it's just an open door essentially into other opportunities as well.
Thank you so much. That's all the questions that we have time for today. I'd just like to say thank you so much to our brilliant panel of inspiring women who've been flying the flag for inspirational, female voices within sustainability today, and all of their help as well and advice. And thank you to everybody who's joined in as well, participating by asking questions and for coming along as well and listening today. I hope you've taken away something from it. I know I've learned a lot. I'd just like to also highlight some of the other events that are still to come this week. So there is a Sustainable Careers Fair and a Fashion and Textiles Showcase at the atrium of the Barbara Hepworth building going on this week during Green Week. But once again, I'd just like to thank you all for coming and for our speakers and yourself for giving up your time today.